Good afternoon, everyone. Daniel was kind enough to prepare me. I know many of you have heard me talk before these things. I rarely use a script. Maybe I should use a script from now on, but what will you tell me? So for this afternoon's voyage, Daniel Harrington, Mr. Harrington, a self-described recovering politician. Please go ahead, give it up. Give it up again. Is a former East Providence City Councilor and longtime monthly columnist for the Providence Journal. He previously worked as a securities principal, presently works as a security principal at Mass Mutual.
I have a real job.
In 2014, Ed Acorn, editor of the Providence Journal, hired Mr. Harrington as a columnist after publishing several of his unsolicited letters to the editor.
Mm-hmm.
What topics were you reading?
Politics, but no more.
For the next 9 years, Mr. Harrington would publish 115 monthly pieces on a wide range of topics. But of all the topics he explored, the sinking of the Larchmont haunted him throughout the years and prompted him to continue his research. The presentation you're about to see is the fruit of that haunting. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan Harrington.
And ladies and gentlemen, excellent job for Kevin, right? Yeah, Kevin, thank you. Thank you for hosting. What a great facility, what a great town, and what a great audience. So let's get some housekeeping out of the way. Whenever I go to a presentation, the first thing I want to know is how long is this guy going to talk? Presentation is about 1 hour to 1 hour and 4 minutes. So it's pretty tight, and if I do my job, you won't notice the time slipping by. Let's see, when I say the journal in the presentation, what do you think I'm referring to? Providence. Very good, our paper, the Projo. When I say the Globe, I'm referring to? Providence. All right, let's get the inelegant out of the way. I'm from Warwick, Rhode Island. I'm born in East Providence. I'm from Warwick right now. That's where our airport is, and you all are up here. Does everybody know what this landmass is here? Very good, Wellesley. The further north I go, the fewer, I get a few people not understanding or remembering. We are provincial in Rhode Island, and New England, as you could say, we are provincial too. So I don't want to make you feel bad by asking that question, but I will share this. If you ask a Rhode Islander, for example, what this landmass is, they will proudly say, France.
Dan, before you start, is the lighting okay for you? I can lower
Yes, I want to compliment you, Kevin, on bringing the house lights down in front of the screen.
Thank you.
My goal is to get your eyes on that screen and keep them there. As charismatic as I pretend to be. So with the lights off, that helps. Shall we get started? News of America's most horrific sea disaster came to the world through the barking of a dog. It was sunrise on February 11th, 1907, and Elam Littlefield, keeper of the North Light on Block Island and owner of that dog, felt his hand fall to his revolver as he heard a desperate pounding over the howls of a dog. Then, racing to the door, Elam watched in fascination as a bloody hand was sliding down the window. Then, opening the door, Littlefield watched a young boy crawl across the threshold, soaking wet, yet also, amazingly, covered in ice. As he collapsed, the boy moaned, "More coming." A few yards away, the lifeboat that once held the boy bobbed in the surf with a frozen collection of tangled bodies, lifeless yet staring blindly into the sun. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Larchmont, where coincidence and superstition, the horrifying and the miraculous, waltz with one another. As Shakespeare memorably said, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. We'll see some of those things today. So let's begin. The place is Providence, Rhode Island, the year 1907. Steam and sail blend together on a river that is the lifeblood of the city. It's the height of the Industrial Revolution, and prosperity reigned. Providence was affluent. Providence was adventurous. The riverfront saw dreamers of every stripe entering and leaving the city, places that captured the imagination of both the young and the old. Places like Block Island, courtesy of the famous steamship Mount Hope, or even New York City on the luxurious steamship Providence out of the Fall River line. Of course, for more budget-minded travelers, meaning cheap tickets, the Larchmont of the Joy Line out of Providence was less expensive than the Fall River ships. For this was the era of the night boats when $1 took you from Providence at 6 p.m. to New York City overnight. And you'd wake up and have breakfast in the Big Apple. Yes, folks, this was Providence in 1907. And it was a wonderful time to be alive. And it was an awful time to have to die on a doomed steamship. Our tale today begins in the shadows of superstition. In 1904, 3 years before the Larchmont sank, a Joy Line steamer from Providence called the Tremont arrives in New York City on a Monday morning, and then, bam, fire consumes the ship. A cook was making breakfast when a spark strayed. Now, trapped inside the ship were, get this, circus lions brought in for a show. The World newspaper famously reported that the firemen had to battle maddened beasts in the flames. Now, despite the great graphic, the story was an absolute fabrication. Now, there were lions aboard, and unfortunately, 2 of them suffocated while still in their cages. But 43 human beings were rescued thanks to 23-year-old George McVeigh of Providence, Rhode Island. He was a pilot who ran into the burning ship, risked his own life pulling people out. And yes, Pilot McVeigh also rescued 1 baby lioness cub. The fire catapults McVeigh into the limelight and atop the slide of destiny, where he's about to begin his descent. But first, say goodbye to the kitty and join me on another very important ship called the Cumberland. You see, the Cumberland proudly served the great city of Boston. Now, on a foggy day in 1902, the Cumberland, under the command of one Captain Allen, collides with the Admiral Farragut, an ugly freighter hauling fruit out of the Caribbean. And what do we normally call a boat out of the Caribbean hauling fruit? You can say it. A banana boat. And yes, there were 32,899 bunches of bananas on the Farragut when she slammed into the Cumberland. So the Cumberland starts to sink outside of Boston Harbor. And the captain then says, I'm going to make a daring run back to the shallow water of the docks. And so he goes and he tries to beach her back at the dock, and he makes it just barely after 300 terrified passengers run off the ship. So she is then declared a total loss by the Eastern Steamship Company, and Eastern sells the Cumberland to the Joy Line at a bargain price, for she's a total loss. However, the Joy Line, in 1 month, repairs her, repaints her, and renames her. Anyone care to guess the new name of the Cumberland? Yes, indeed, folks. Even though it's bad luck to change the name of the ship, the Cumberland is proudly renamed Larchmont after a posh village just outside the Bronx. And she's delivered quickly to her new home in Providence, Rhode Island. And then it begins. Just weeks after being renamed, fire breaks out in her storage hold just off the Bronx. The fire is contained, but 200 people, terrorized, leave the ship. A year after that, she runs down a schooner named the Melanson off Stratford, Connecticut. No loss of life, but plenty of damage. And the next year, she runs aground in our Prudence Island in Narragansett Bay, stranding passengers for 4 hours until a kind tugboat comes along. And then in February of 1905, almost 2 years to the day before she sank, a passenger named John A. Hott is shot in the head and robbed while sleeping aboard the Larchmont. Of course, the crime is never solved. Hey, anyone here in Wellesley care to guess the stateroom number Hart was sleeping in?
13.
Very good, my friend. So, given its history of fires, murders, and collisions with banana boats, folks around New England start to call the Larchmont the hoodoo ship, the cursed ship of the joy line. But of course, we know there are no such things as curses, right? Now, meanwhile, Pilot McVeigh continues to impress his corporate betters, and he's finally made a captain in 1906. He's only 26 years old, and he's given his very own ship, the Larchmont, shown here in Providence, Rhode Island. 117 years separate these photos, but so little has changed. Now, nothing is so essential in understanding the Larchmont disaster as the unusual weather that accompanied the tragedy. The temperature that night was 2 degrees below zero. The wind was gusting up to 50 miles per hour and produced 25-foot waves. Still, passengers came, so the ship left. And this is where they boarded today. This is where they boarded the ship. Today it's a cigar bar in Tel Aviv called, cigar bar in Providence called Tel Aviv. And if you look at the unusual roof, it hasn't changed in over a century. And through this door, quite literally, is where passengers on the Larchmont went through that evening. Most never to return. This is the crew of the Larchmont on February 11th. Captain McVeigh proudly sits in the front row, but right to his right was pilot John Anson, age 32, also from Providence. Anson's important. He'll be at the helm of the Larchmont when trouble comes calling. Now, in addition to locals, there were people from all over the world aboard the Larchmont that evening. Not only from Rhode Island, but mostly from that enchanting place called Massachusetts. Let's meet a few. Harris and Bertha Feldman were returning to their home in New York City. Now, Harris, age 40, was a burly Jewish man whose work with the Order of the Eagles, a civic organization of the day, had brought him to Providence. Feldman once served in the Russian Navy. And coincidentally, you'll hear that word a lot today, coincidentally, he survived a winter shipwreck on the Black Sea, of all places. That experience would prove fortuitous for Mr. Feldman, so remember his name. The diversity among the passengers was striking, and including members of the Eastern Scandinavian Corps of the Salvation Army, better known as the Swedish Salvationists. They were from cities predominantly in Massachusetts, namely Worcester and Lynn. And they were all steaming down to New York to attend a large officers' conference. And we can't forget the incredible and mystical Millard Franklin of nearby North Attleboro, Mass. Get this, Millard was a frequent flyer on the Larchmont, and he called himself the Boy Houdini, and made a career of imitating the greatest celebrity of the day, the actual Harry Houdini. Now, Millard would often leave home unannounced to perform in New York. In fact, his mother was unaware of his even being aboard the Larchmont on this evening. Now, like his hero, Millard would free himself from traps and perform death-defying feats. So the question is, was the young escape artist truly worthy of the master's name? Or was he just a big dreamer, like all of the crew whispered behind his back? Trust me, we'll find out. Now, folks, get ready for her. Say hello to the wonderful Miss Sadie Golub of Boston. Sadie was everything her picture portends, a flamboyant belle from the city. Now, Sadie was on her way to look after her sister in New York City, who had just given birth to a child, and that child was gravely ill. Now, flexing your imaginations, what character from the movie Titanic, what young character might Miss Golub remind us of? Perhaps young Rose, right? Yeah. Well, I'll remind you that Rose was a fictitious character. And our Sadie was all too real, as you'll discover. And folks, please beware of Larchmont and Titanic comparisons, for they're ubiquitous in New England for some reason. For I assure you, and I promise you, the tale you are about to hear will make Titanic look like a Disney cartoon. The Larchmont left Providence at 7 p.m. that night as evening settled on the city. There were probably well over 200 people on board that evening, but we'll never know. The passenger list went down with the ship. Upon boarding, many made their way to the saloon or dining area of the ship, where they were greeted by the lilting sounds of a piano player. That is, until Millard Franklin, the boy Houdini, entered the room with great fanfare and dazzled passengers with his well-rehearsed antics and charm. But then, on this evening, and with equal fanfare, Captain McVeigh himself enters the saloon and halts the boy Houdini and announces a sudden change in the entertainment for the evening. The crowd then watched with great delight as the young Salvation Army group enters the room. 3 very pretty girls, one passenger remembered. The striking ladies, equipped with an acoustic guitar, then gave an impromptu concert featuring gospel hymns and preaching. Passengers listed, one noted, some with pleasure, others because they had no choice, which speaks to the power of the Salvationist women. Keep in mind, these were not the stereotypical bell ringers we may think of today. No, these were top-notch, pedigreed individuals. And I think it's fair to say that, no offense to the boy Houdini, it was the ladies who owned the room that night. From the back of that room, Captain McVeigh, a deacon in the church, held back tears as he watched and listened to the women fill his ship with hymns. What an amazing night, he whispered to himself. Now, of course, McVeigh, nor anybody else in the room, knew that at that exact moment, death held them all in the palm of his hand. It was just before 10 p.m. McVeigh then leaves the room to make his inspection rounds. The Larchmont had just passed Jamestown, Rhode Island, opposite of Newport. Meanwhile, the Harry Knowlton, a 3-masted schooner, 128 feet long, somewhat shorter than the 250-foot Larchmont, was carrying a heavy load of coal from New Jersey to Everett, Massachusetts. The Knowlton was commanded by Captain Frank Haley, pictured here to the right of McVeigh. Haley of Everett, Massachusetts, was a 58-year-old father of 15 who'd been a captain for over 30 years. Now, the wind was gusting up to 50 miles an hour, but visibility that night was perfectly clear. Neither ship had any trouble seeing the other. So what happened? The Larchmont was heading west towards New York, the Knowlton heading east towards Cape Cod. The two ships would meet 3 miles south of Watch Hill and 8 miles north of Block Island. My Wellesley friends, does everybody know why Wakefield and Watch Hill, Rhode Island is popular right now? We have a resident living there you may have heard of. Taylor Swift, yeah, they're going to get married there. But anyway, back to 1907, Quartermaster James Staples is steering the ship. And one audience member once yelled, "With his ears?" He was taking orders from pilot John Anson. As mentioned, McVeigh was making his inspection rounds. This graph nicely illustrates both captains' official versions of the crash given to the Globe after the crash. Now, McVeigh's version on top has the Knowlton 2 ship lengths away from the Larchmont when she suddenly makes a daring turn. Captain Haley's explanation, perhaps more realistic, simply has 2 ships headed straight for one another and unyielding. Here's what we know. At 10:20, Captain McVeigh returns to the bridge. Pilot Anson stood at the center window. McVeigh then heads down to his cabin to tend to paperwork. His cabin was just under the bridge. And that's when Anson first saw the bow and the stern lights of the Knowlton. Now, Anson assumed the two vessels would pass fairly close, but with enough space in between them. So he didn't budge. But as the ships drew closer, it was clear they were headed straight for each other. So finally, Anson decides to act. For God's sake, Staples, port the wheel, which means in those days, turning that big old steamship wheel towards the left so the Larchmont would swing towards the right. However, the high winds caused the Larchmont to turn agonizingly slow, yet pushed the Knowlton toward the Larchmont at a much faster rate than Anson had anticipated. So again he cries out, port the wheel, and then blows the ship whistle 4 times, the universal distress signal. Up from his cabin comes McVeigh. Seeing the Knowlton now just a few feet off the bow, McVeigh looks at Anson and yells, "My God, John Anson, what have you done?" Anson didn't move or reply. He just stood there frozen, staring at the Knowlton through his binoculars. Then came the crash. The Knowlton rams into the port side of the Larchmont just forward of the paddle wheel. Some say Anson's last-minute turn was worse than doing nothing. Had he not turned, the two ships would have likely sideswiped each other with less damage. But the sudden turn caused the Knowlton to T-bone the Larchmont. In fact, the two ships actually stay stuck together for a few moments until separated by the waves. So McVeigh quickly inspected the damage and instantly thought of trying to beach the ship. But the ship's engine was unresponsive. You see, the Knowlton scored an absolute bullseye, crushing the watertight compartments. Almost instantly, the Larchmont begins to sink. If that wasn't worse enough, the crash actually severed the Larchmont's main steam pipe, releasing huge clouds of toxic steam throughout the ship. And, for good measure, the ship's generator was also knocked out. So folks found themselves in total darkness while still in their pajamas. Most had no chance of escaping. Passengers came running out of their staterooms only to find the now docked saloon crowded with screaming people who instantly started to choke to death on the scalding steam. So Captain McVeigh orders the crew straight to the lifeboats. But panic takes over. Most of the lifeboats were never touched by a crew member. Even so, McVeigh then orders the lifeboats to be lowered right away. Now, Captain McVeigh's lifeboat happens to sit right outside the pilot house. So guess what? In he goes. Yep. His thinking was this: he and the crew will have a better chance of finding passengers once their own lifeboats are in the water. It's a fateful decision, and the press does not buy it. In the end, only 4 of the 8 lifeboats survived the sinking. Before lowering his boat, McVeigh inspects the chief engineer's lifeboat. No one ever saw that lifeboat again. It was full of people, mostly crew members. Witnesses say that just after launching, 3 panicked men jump in that lifeboat and send it to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Once in the water, McVeigh begins to row towards the port side of the Larchmont where he hopes to find passengers, but his efforts are useless. The wind was just too strong, so McVeigh then watched the Larchmont sink on an even keel. She basically went down straight. She sank in about 15 minutes, maybe less. It was just after 11 p.m. and a few hundred yards away, the gorgeous steamship Providence I showed you earlier steams by the sinking Larchmont. Yet she is invisible because all her lights were off. Although invented, the Larchmont was not equipped with a wireless radio, and no one thought to shoot off a flare. That's what panic does. Now, meanwhile, The Harry Knowlton, having sustained damage to her bow, was taking on water, so Captain Haley decides to try to beach her at Watch Hill, 3 miles away. But by morning, it was clear she would bottom out off the shore. So Haley orders his 7-member crew into a single lifeboat. And fortunately, the lifesavers at the Quanticottag Life-Saving Station in Charlestown, Rhode Island, were ready to assist, and all 7 crew members of the Knowlton are saved. Aboard the Larchmont, however, the situation was quite different. Water was flooding the Larchmont at a rate of about 2 feet per minute, fast enough to convince you of your doom, yet slow enough to let you sink in all the horror of it. It was pitch black, the air filled with poison as people trampled on one another trying to make it out of the lower decks. Some tried to swim their way out. Those that never made it out of that particular hell, or those that did make it out of that particular hell, were greeted with a new one. Sub-zero weather and 50-mile-an-hour winds, which produced a wind-driven surf that made passengers feel as if a fire hose was turned on them. The result, instant frostbite, unimaginable pain, and abject panic. Said one survivor, the passengers were shouting, weeping, and praying. The men were screaming louder than the women. People were pushed overboard. Others jumped. A woman with a little boy in her arms was pleading to be taken into a lifeboat. She was thrust aside. "My baby," she cried. "If we must die, we'll die together." Snuggling the baby to her breast, she jumped overboard with the weeping child in her arms. Others would follow, hoping to find refuge in the icy waters. They didn't. They clung to debris or begged to be rescued, but the Arctic wind quickly silenced most of them. Those that never made it out of the ship feared no better. As the Fall River Globe grimly proclaimed, many passengers drowned like rats in their cabin, as men fought like wild beasts, as this close-up of the painting by Achille Beltrami chillingly demonstrates. And yes, those are knives pictured in the men's hands in Beltrami's painting. Yet even Beltrami, a European master, couldn't quite capture the real horror of the situation. So picture everything you see in his painting covered in a couple of inches of ice, including the people. And then you'll get an idea of what it was really like for those poor souls that night.
Excuse me.
Now, if there was any upside to the weather, it was this. During the night, the winds and the waves steered the lifeboats and the dead bodies not into the open sea, but to the northern portion of Block Island called Sandy Point. This is an aerial shot of Sandy Point. And yes, the North Lighthouse is still there today. And this is where the bodies and the lifeboats came ashore around dawn on Tuesday morning. Oliver Janvier found his way to one such boat. Several men joined him. "Then I saw a woman floating on a piece of wreckage," he said. "I wanted to save her, but the other fellows in the boat got scared and took away the oars. She hung there right before our eyes, crying out to us. Every time she would dip under a wave, she'd pop up and scream at us to save her. But the men wouldn't do it. They let her drown." Eventually, all 10 men in the boat with Oliver froze to death. One, a barber by trade, pulled out his straight razor and slit his throat ear to ear. Around dawn, Oliver shoves an oar under his arm and collapsed on it, hoping it would steer the boat to Block Island. And it did. He was barely alive when rescuers found him. Fred Heigesell, his story was similar to Oliver's. Fred was a 16-year-old German boy who, according to the Providence Journal, was unusually bright for a lad of that nationality. He jumped into a lifeboat with 10 other men Are you sensing a pattern here, ladies? One by one, Fred watches them all freeze to death. When his lifeboat approached Sandy Point, he decides to jump in the water. "Oh, I can swim good," he said, "and I couldn't stand all those dead men in the boat staring at me any longer." So Fred swims for a couple of minutes when, coincidentally, a huge wave hurls him on to Sandy Point. Yes, Fred was the one banging on Keeper Littlefield's lighthouse window at the start of our story. Meanwhile, Captain McVeigh's lifeboat also washes ashore on Sandy Point with 7 crew members and 1 dead passenger, a Russian man who had taken his own life with a knife. He was in great pain as one half of his face was scalded by the steam and the other half was frostbite. So yes, he was burning and freezing to death. So he plunged the knife into his throat. Twice. I told you. This makes Titanic look like a Disney cartoon. Upon being rescued, the frozen crew members unable to walk were carried to the lifeguard station. Of course, like Purser Oscar Young, they all had on their outer coats, which probably kept them from freezing to death. Giuseppe Falade was in a lifeboat with 20 people, including several women, and his son, Nicola. Quoting the journal, Giuseppe smiled as he displayed his swollen hands, which hadn't burst open like the others, but his joyfulness disappeared, added the paper, when he described the death of his boy Nicola. "Yes, my boy is dead, I row. I stamped my feet so not to freeze to death. But Nicola lay still in the boat and died 1 hour before we reached land." Giuseppe was the only survivor in a boatload of 20 people. William Headley's lifeless body was found floating off of Block Island wearing a life jacket but with a boat hook protruding from his chest. Born in the West Indies, Headley of Roxbury was a steward on the Larchmont, and his death was deemed another suicide. However, the fishermen who found him, of the Block Island vessel Theresa, named Captain Sanchez, himself a colored man, added the journal, defended his race from the vulgar insinuation of suicide. Quoting Sanchez phonetically, the journal said that Sanchez described, "They'll survive a long time, especially in the water." Headley was likely pierced with the boat hook while attempting to jump into one of the lifeboats by a now dead passenger who feared he'd tip it over, for this too is human nature. But not all is bad. The tale of the Swedish Salvationists assisting passengers as the Larchmont sank lives in infamy. Led by captains Anne Runberg and Helga Helgren, the women exhorted their partners not to save themselves, but to attend to the passengers. First, by assisting them with life jackets and directing them to the lifeboats. And then, when the ship began its final descent, the Salvationists gathered hand in hand on the upper deck of the Larchmont, sang hymns, and implored the doomed passengers to make peace with God. Unlike the crew of the Larchmont, all 10 of the Salvationists, 7 of which were women, willingly went down with the ship. And then Monday night found Tuesday morning. The sinking is headline news all over the world. And in particular, led by the media in Boston, Massachusetts. Meanwhile, on Block Island, the grim task of collecting the dead begins. The tiny community embraced the call of duty and spent the next 48 hours finding, retrieving, and caring for both the living and the dead. Now remember that in 1907, Henry Ford's Model T was still a year or two away from civilization. So horse-drawn carriages were the norm on Block Island, in addition to horse-drawn wagons and carts, and that is why the dead were collected in wagons supplied by all the islanders. The victims were frozen solid, many with their arms still in the position of clutching whatever it was they could find as they froze to death in the water. Most were covered in up to 7 to 8 inches of ice. Demonstrating the horror of frostbite, many victims died with their hands frozen over their ears. Here, the body of a young woman, well dressed, was added to the cart shown in the last picture. They even had a team of oxen hauling a cart of the dead off the beach. If you look closely, you'll see what appears to be sticks or branches jutting out of the cart. They're not. They are the frozen limbs of the dead protruding from the blankets. This truly was a nightmare. Some were taken here to the Sandy Point Life-Saving Station, which served as both a morgue and a hospital, where the many dead crowded out the living. Others were taken here to the Old Harbor Life-Saving Station. The men who worked at these places were called surfmen and predated our Coast Guard's men and women. Now, meanwhile, a Joy Line steamer named Kentucky arrives at Block Island around noon on Tuesday to retrieve both the living and the dead. This was especially important for the survivors, as Block Island lacked a proper hospital. And Providence's Rhode Island hospital stood by waiting for the survivors. However, the Kentucky was forbidden to leave Block Island. Dr. J.C. Champlin, a local physician, orders the bodies of both the living and the dead to remain on Block Island overnight for examination rather than being dispatched to Providence. It's a harsh and unnecessary decree, and guess what? He holds fast to it. Of course, papers like the Boston Post depicted lifeboats landing on Sandy Point with gentrified passengers being greeted by a team of lifesavers. The reality was quite different, as the postcard I'm about to show you reveals, and please be forewarned, it's pretty graphic. Now remember, a century ago, postcards were the social media of the day. Delivering and transmitting hard news, not glad tidings, and that is why someone would place a stamp on this most gruesome of cards. So, yes, ladies and gentlemen, the story of the Larchmont is revolting in its graphic horror, taking us to the very depths of human misery. But what if, through the ugliness, there came glints of life and whispers of miracles? Could you believe them? Well, consider the fishing schooner Elsie. There's a fishing boat along at sea. She's not lost at sea, but close. She is tired. She is covered in ice. Her men are beyond weary, and they're frostbitten. It's late Tuesday morning, and she is the Elsie. And she's searching for bodies off of Block Island, but the weather is still so bad, the mission has become most dangerous as the ship is icing up. Now, the Elsie is skippered by Captain John Smith of Block Island and counts 3 of his sons among her crew. Now, just before 11 a.m. on Tuesday morning, they decide they'd better head home. And then they saw it. One of the Smith boys shouted, "Captain, wreckage ahead! Captain, there's something floating out there!" Now, what the Elsie spotted was a portion of the Larchmont called the hurricane deck, essentially a row of 5 staterooms and cabin that was bolted onto the ship when she changed from the Cumberland to the Larchmont. As the Larchmont was sinking, this structure separated from the ship, and about 35 people gathered on this portion of it, on the top of it, as it floated away, where hypothermia quickly began to kill them. Now, as the Elsie approaches the hurricane deck, the Smith boy continues to report what he saw. "Captain, there are frozen bodies stuck on that wreckage. Repeat, dead bodies." In other words, we aren't going anywhere. Our recovery work is not done. But as the Elsie gets closer to the hurricane deck, the boy becomes absolutely hysterical. Captain, Dad, I don't believe it. They're alive. There are people moving on that thing. That's impossible, cried the others. You couldn't make it a half hour on that damn thing. But there were people alive and moving on the hurricane deck, thanks to Harris Feldman. As the Larchmont was going down, Feldman, the Russian Navy vet, muscled his way to a lifeboat and then hoisted his considerable wife Bertha into the lifeboat. Then stepped away, telling Bertha he'd see her later. Now, reading her husband's face, Bertha then jumps out of the lifeboat and back into the water to be with her doomed husband. Coincidentally, a wave washes Bertha back aboard the Larchmont, where Harris gathers her up and somehow they make it up to the hurricane deck soaking wet. Now, meanwhile, Sadie Golub, tiny Sadie Golub, manages to fight her way out of the lower decks. She was still in her evening dress when a woman shocked her by instructing her to put on her coat, which Sadie was carrying because she was in shock. The woman then told her to hold still as she fashioned a life preserver around Sadie. Anyone care to guess what kind of woman would have done that? One of the Massachusetts Salvationists fulfilling their duty to attend to the passengers. So Sadie mysteriously then fights her way from the front of the ship to the back of the ship and to the hurricane deck. When she arrives, she hears Feldman speaking to his wife in Hebrew and yells, "Save me, I'm a Jewish girl too." Feldman turns to the girl he had never met and said, "If I am saved, you will be saved. If we die, we'll die together." Hollywood couldn't come up with a better line. Also on the deck was Sam Lacombe, a dashing, handsome 21-year-old from Manchester, New Hampshire. Get this, Lacombe had actually worked as an acrobat in the Barnum and Bailey Circus and was on his way to New York for that purpose. Tony Rezagovich was a Polish immigrant living in Rhode Island's Central Falls. He'd been in America for just 1 month. David Fox of New Jersey, who was returning from a Bible conference in Boston, found himself on the hurricane deck and immediately begins to pray out loud when he reaches the deck. Now also on the deck but not pictured was a crew member named Richard Hall. Now Feldman understood the danger they all faced, quoting him, "I could see strong men toppling over into the sleep that could only mean death. I realized that unless I adopted heroic measures, I would see my wife perish also. She lay between the bodies of 2 dead men and was drifting into that fatal sleep. And so, with the last vestige of strength left in me," said Feldman, "I began to beat her to revive her flagging life. I struck her on the face and on the body and spared not the blows. For 10 minutes I continued the drubbing until, my joy, she opened her eyes and was able to sit up in my arms. The violence of my effort," said Feldman, "served the double purpose of reviving my own spirit." So Feldman goes to work on the others. "Keep moving," he commanded. "Don't lie down with the dead. Strike one another hard when necessary." Harris directed Sam Lacombe to revive Sadie Golub, who had fallen asleep, and told him to watch over her. He insisted David Fox keep praying out loud. And hearing Fox praying the Psalms of the Old Testament, Feldman cried, "Hey, Fox, are you Jewish?" "Sir, no, sir," Fox replied. "I'm from New Jersey." Feldman was in complete control and seemed to possess superhuman power. And all who listened stayed alive throughout the entire night. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, Feldman, still alive, sees the shore of Block Island in the distance. So he thinks fast and strips a shirt off a dead passenger and starts waving it frantically. To no avail. Unlike the lifeboats, the hurricane deck drifts right past Sandy Point and goes out into the Atlantic Ocean. All hope is lost. Then, around 11 a.m., 12 hours after the Larchmont sank, the 8 survivors see the Wellesley breaking through the fog, and everything was new again. Against long odds and 20-foot waves, the crew of the Wellesley launches 2 small fishing dories, like the one pictured here, and manages to pull the survivors from the deck one at a time. Crew members wondered how any of them could still be alive. They are then loaded aboard the Wellesley and bundled up. The Wellesley, with Old Glory flying, delivers the survivors to Block Island. But like the ice-covered ship, the survivors were in rough shape. In fact, Sadie Golub's teeth, for example, were stuck together so firmly it was 3 hours before a doctor could pry them apart. But they were alive. Consider, the weather caused hardened men to slit their own throat, murder others, and watch women drown. Yet 8 people on a large piece of wood stayed alive in the open ocean for over 12 hours. Miracle? Would have been a miracle to survive 1 hour. The hurricane deck eventually and eerily washes ashore 1 day later. Now, back on Block Island, the surfmen convinced Dr. Champlin to allow the survivors to be transported from the Sandy Point Life-Saving Station to the steamship Kentucky to make use of her warm beds for their mandatory overnight stay. The Kentucky is anchored right off Sandy Point, 25 yards off of Sandy Point. So Champlin lets this happen. He says the Kentucky can't leave until I examine everybody. But they do gather up the passengers. There are only 19 survivors at this point. So they're loaded into carriages and brought to the beach where a longboat will shuttle them out to the Kentucky. However, when Sadie Golub sees how much the Kentucky looks like the Larchmont, she gets hysterical and bounces out of the carriage. She refuses to go into the longboat and on the Kentucky. She ends up being cared for by a local family called the Millikins and stays on Block Island for 3 weeks. The rest of the survivors are only happy to be loaded onto the longboat for the short trip out to the Kentucky. Captain McVeigh is among those hoisted aboard the Kentucky. The Globe tells its readers to notice the condition of his frostbitten hands, as if he were still trying to row the lifeboat. In this image, the rest of the survivors are hoisted onto the Kentucky. They're bedded down for the night, but are denied the comfort of sleep as their bodies start to defrost, causing them to toss and sob throughout the entire night. And that brings us to Wednesday, the second day after the collision. And yes, we're in the home stretch of our presentation, so it's time for a little audience participation. We'll have some fun and actually see the guitar come out. So I was wondering if you could do me a favor, Wellesley. On the count of 3, would you all please read out loud the subtitle of this slide? 1, 2, 3. Excellent. Give it to me again. Very well done. In fact, in a little while, I'm going to say it. And I'd like you to repeat that line once again. Fair enough? Excellent. Let's go. Let's continue. At 3 in the afternoon on Wednesday, Dr. Champlin finally allows the Kentucky to steam to Providence. A photographer snaps the Feldmans aboard the Kentucky. You'll notice that Harris's hands are pretty well swollen with frostbite. The steamer arrives in Providence around 7 p.m. as darkness hits the city and docks right where the very popular Fish Company Tavern is in Providence today. McVeigh, ignoring optics, McVeigh is the first off the ship. And he's well enough to walk to a carriage where his wife takes him home. He only lives a couple blocks away. The rest of the survivors aren't so lucky. They're loaded into carriages and taken to Rhode Island Hospital, where they will be treated for severe frostbite. Some will endure amputations. Finally, the dead are removed. A few found coffins on Block Island, as you can see in this photo. But given that most of the dead were covered in 7 to 8 inches of ice. Most of them had to be hoisted off the Kentucky with the ship's freight crane. Can you imagine? They were then transported by carriage just 2 blocks away to the Thomas Monahan Mortuary on Wickenden Street, a very popular, if not the most popular, coffee shop on the Brown University campus in Providence. Yes, the structure is unchanged from its days as a funeral home, at least on the outside. I've yet to go in there and order a cappuccino with a shot of formaldehyde, but I'm going to do it. Now, you'll notice next to the coffee house, pretty amazing, in downtown Providence, like downtown Boston, there's actually an empty lot right beside the coffee exchange. And that, my friends, is where the carriage house for the funeral home once stood. The carriage house is the garage, of course, for all the hearses of the mortuary. And it was in this room by lantern light. The dead bodies were all laid out for identification. This illustration from the Daily Item of Lynn captures the haunting mood at Monahan's where, quote, 49 stiffened forms, twisted into many curious shapes, rested on empty casket cases with ghastly expressions of utter terror frozen on their faces, end quote. Family members wept as they identified their dead, yet in a mostly solemn way. That is, until things get out of hand, when a woman starts screaming and leaps on one of the bodies. It takes several men to remove her from the corpse. "Don't tear me away from my darling," she cries. "Please don't tear me away." She is the mother of Millard Franklin, the boy Houdini. A few days later, hundreds attend his funeral in North Attleboro, Massachusetts, at the service. An old African-American hymn is sung for the boy Houdini, for Millard, who spent far too many nights aboard the Larchmont. I'd like to play you the verse of that ancient hymn. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long, long way from home. A long, long way from home. Yes. Thank you. News of Millard's passing is telegraphed everywhere. And in New York City, Henry Wheats, a.k.a. Harry Houdini, wires funds to the Franklin family to cover the entire expense of burying Millard and then some. So say it. Yes, Millard was a month or two away from national stardom and a contract when the Larchmont came calling. A year after his death, you'll notice his mother, Laura, passed away of broken heart. Sam Lacombe, the acrobat from New Hampshire, shocked the physicians when he arrives at Rhode Island Hospital. You see, when awakened by the crash, Lacombe found his cabin already being filled with water, so he immediately fled. When he arrives at the hurricane deck, the others were just stunned to see a man barefoot and in his underwear. Sam simply didn't have time to dress. As they examined him, one doctor simply whispered, "Impossible." Sam's arms and legs were completely frozen, and yes, even his back was frozen solid. Death should have come to Lacombe within an hour of reaching the hurricane deck, but he pressed on. At least 3 times during the night, he pulls Sadie Golub from the water as rogue waves threaten to wash her away, soaking the near-naked man again and again. But he never leaves her side, and something kept him alive throughout the night. Love is stronger than death, the Old Testament says. The photo you see here shows Lacombe just after he boards the Kentucky and just before he himself would lose consciousness due to the trauma of his body defrosting. Sam lingered for nearly 2 days before dying at Rhode Island Hospital on Thursday, February 14th, Valentine's Day. To honor him, the Journal published the whole of the poem Invictus by Henley, which reads in part, "Though black is the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul." A few days after that, leaders of the Salvation Army in England arranged for the funeral for 3 of the 10 Swedish Salvationists lost in the disaster. Expecting several hundred people, they secure Carnegie Hall in New York City. However, an hour before the funeral, police are called as over 1,000 people are waiting outside. By the time the service begins, however, there are 5,000 people inside Carnegie Hall and another 10,000 people standing outside, still the largest crowd ever to assemble there. British Salvation Army commander Ava Booth eulogized the Salvationists lost that night and recounted how the Salvationists sang Rock of Ages and Nearer My God to Thee as the Larchmont sank, and in so doing would inspire all of England, including 8 musicians who followed their very example by reprising Nearer My God to Thee on the doomed ship they were on, called Titanic, 5 years later. So, New Englanders, please stop calling the Larchmont Rhode Island's Titanic. You see, we have it backwards. Titanic was Europe's Larchmont. Got a little head there. Now, in the end, there were only 18 survivors, 10 of which were crew members. The investigation by the Steamship Inspection Service found the Larchmont negligent in the crash, and in particular pilot John Anson, as maritime law requires steamships to yield the right-of-way to sailing ships, which is why Captain Haley of the Knowlton never thought of turning. He knew, as all captains did, that it was the steamship's job to get the hell out of the way. One newspaper said the cause of the crash was simply John Anson's bullheadedness. Anson went down with the ship. After the disaster, all ships were required to keep passenger lists separate from the vessel. The victims and survivors were allowed to collectively share in all the monies salvaged from the Joy Line and pay for the disaster. That amount they all were to share was $143.12. Captain McVeigh was found to be, quote, get this, neither commendable nor censorable for his actions. But the press, particularly the Massachusetts press, eviscerated the Rhode Islander with headlines like this, nearly to the point of suicide. Sadie Golub even tells a reporter that Captain McVeigh himself had refused her entry into his lifeboat. However, the story was proven false, as Sadie was likely refused by a lesser crew member because the wall of steam prevented her from being anywhere near the front of the boat with McVeigh. Now, Sadie eventually marries, and she makes her home in a city called New Bedford, Massachusetts. She died in 1955 and is buried in Richmond, New York. Now, her headstone actually leads the last survivor of the Larchmont shipwreck and includes a striking graphic of the hurricane deck with Sadie on it, albeit all alone. And this is the closest thing we have to a Larchmont memorial. Incidentally, Sadie, the little baby Sadie was on her way to save that that night, died at the very hour the Larchmont sank. The press was stunned to find Harris Feldman conversing freely with the other survivors just one day after being rescued. Get this, the Globe calls Feldman, quote, a splendid specimen of substantial manhood. I'd love that as my epitaph someday. The governor of Rhode Island presents Feldman the Silver Medal for the U.S. Life-Saving Service. Feldman and his wife Bertha eventually settle in Chicago where their great-grandchildren still remember them. The crew of the Captain Smith's Elsie were presented the Carnegie Gold Medal of Heroism by the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. Sam Lacombe posthumously received the Silver Medal from the U.S. Life-Saving Service. Now, official estimates of the death toll of the Larchmont are about 140 to 160. We'll never know. On his deathbed, though, in 1959, Quartermaster James Staples made a stunning confession. Staples, who always counted the total aboard, confessed that no less than 332 souls perished that evening. Are you still with me, Wesley? 18 years after the disaster, this is important, stay with me. 18 years after the disaster, in August of 1925, the steamship Mackinac out of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, was carrying 700 people to an outing in Newport, Rhode Island, for the employees of the J.P. Coates Textile Company. As the Mackinac left Newport that day, her boiler exploded, releasing a great cloud of toxic steam. Sound familiar? 55 people were scorched to death, including little children. One 10-year-old girl memorably held up her scalded arms and pleaded, "Somebody please blow on them, for they hurt me so." Resting in the captain's quarters at the time of the blast was 45-year-old Captain George McVeigh of Providence, Rhode Island. Although found not responsible for a faulty boiler repair that caused the Mackinac to explode, although not at the helm of the Larchmont when it rammed the Knowlton, although not responsible for the fire that killed the Lions on the Tremont, McVeigh was nevertheless forbidden to again skipper a ship containing passengers. Thus it appears superstition weighed heavily in his sentencing. The captain died in 1951. He was 71. In 1941, a local newspaper discovered that a portion of the hurricane deck was being used as a sheepfold by a thrifty Block Islander. Pretty funny. 118 years after the tragedy, coal from the Harry Knowlton's cargo hold still washes up on the beach from time to time in Charlestown, Rhode Island. I'm told the dogs in particular are very good at finding it. In 1964, divers finally discovered the Larchmont, aka the Cumberland, 3 miles off the coast of Wellesley, 130 feet below the surface. The ship's boilers and paddle wheels were still visible when this photo was taken back in 2014, but because she rests in a fishing lane, the nets are slowly destroying her. Now, before I show you our final slide, I did want to ask you, if you haven't got a paper with the QR code, please make a note of that. It'll be up on the screen as the end of the conversation. You can shoot a picture of it. So if you have any information on the Larchmont, a lot of people do, and they help me out, please get in contact with me. Or if you know an organization that would appreciate that, I certainly appreciate you forwarding that to them. It's funny, I was telling some people earlier, the QR code's brand new. I just started that. I used to have my email up here, my Yahoo email, but an audience member in Little Compton said, "Mr. Harrington, your email address is as old as the Larchmont." In 1869, Dickens wrote, "And then I looked at the stars and considered how awful it would be for a man to turn his face up to them as he froze to death, and see no help or pity in all the glittering multitude." Such was the case for many aboard the Larchmont that night. But others, a precious few, didn't indeed observe the glittering sons and daughters of the light shining through both man and nature's darkest hour, and we all should remember them well. And it's in their honor that I dedicate today's presentation. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's voyage of the Larchmont. I'm Daniel Harrington.